This video is going to focus on what factors sort of make you more likely to actually show up and vote in the first place. And again, there's some like generalizations to some of the data I'm going to show you, but this is just showing you sort of like what factors um, maybe make it more likely for you to vote, like what groups are more likely to show up to vote. And again, this is not who you're voting for. This is just your willingness to even vote, right? So first thing is there is a huge difference in just general people's willingness to vote in a presidential year versus a non-presidential year. So if you look at like presidential election years, you tend to see like about a little bit more than 50% of eligible voters will like show up to vote, which is you know it is what it is, right? You kind of see that like it sort of goes back and forth a little bit, but this is like voter turnout rate, and then you can see like in midterms elections and non-presidential election years, you definitely see less people. So it's like the presidential election that gets people to vote, right? If there's not a presidential election, then you won't necessarily vote, right? Also, if you compare primaries to general presidential elections, there's a huge difference. So if you can see, like this is the total number of sort of like voting eligible people in our country that actually show up to vote in primary elections, like the screening out process. So, in some pretty bad years, it's been like 16%. In a higher year, it's like 30%. It's a lot of people that aren't voting, right? It's not a whole lot of people that are actually showing up, right? In a presidential election year, again, you can see that depending on like the year, like in 2020, it was like pretty high. It was like 67%. So you're talking about like considerably more people voting in like the final election than the elections that are like narrowing down your party's candidates, right? So definitely less people vote in the primaries than in the general presidential election. And again, if you just look at like overall international voter turnout, a little bit of an outdated slide, but you kind of see where we're hovering on average about 56%, somewhere around there, and that's definitely less than a lot of other like similar countries to us. All right, other factors, right? On average, women are more likely to vote than men, right? There's like greater percentages of eligible women voters that show up compared to men. It's not a huge difference, but it's a slight nod in favor of women. This is pretty consistent from like 1980 all the way through like 2016, which is the last election on this chart. That shows you there's a slightly larger percentage of women that vote than men. Turnout by age, right? So you can see this. This is almost like showing you that there is a direct correlation between your age and your willingness to show up and vote. The 60 plus group shows up in mass to vote, right? Like generally about 70% of the 60 plusers will show up to vote. And then less of each group down to the 18 to 29-year-olds, where like you're looking at somewhere between like 20 and 40%. And again, like if you're a young person and you complain that politicians only talk about issues that old people care about, well, this is why, right? It's older people are more likely to vote, and they're going to cater their message right towards the people like that will determine whether they get to keep their jobs or not, right? So if younger people show up in larger numbers to vote, you'll definitely see politicians sort of like change the message, right? So something to kind of think about. Also, if you look at the sort of impact on like race and ethnicity, the blue lines are essentially white individuals. The red line is African Americans. Green line is Hispanic, and the purple line is other. So a couple things you can note, right? That you definitely see larger sort of like numbers in the both the Hispanic and African American categories, like large percentages voting in the modern era, right? For most of our country's history, clearly there were larger percentages of white individuals that voted, and this has changed a little bit in modern times, right? So larger numbers or percentages of minorities sort of like are now willing to vote. And you see, it's kind of interesting if you look at the sort of like white share of the overall like percentage of the electorate, like what percentage of voters are white it's pretty interesting. From like the mid '80s through modern times, this number has been on a steady decline. That though, I mean, this number is still like 72%. This basically means that in every election, we're seeing minorities making up a larger share of sort of like the percentage of the people voting. And then if you look at like education, right? There is a direct correlation to your education and your willingness to vote. The general trend is the more educated you are, the more likely you are to actually show up and vote. So you basically see those numbers reflected. Purple basically are like postgraduate stuff. Green is some college to college grad. Red is just a high school graduate, and then blue is like less than a high school graduate. And then family income too. So if you look, there also is a direct correlation between your family income and your willingness to vote. Right, the more money generally your family makes, the more likely you are to actually vote. Right, the less money you make as a family, lower socioeconomic status, the less you are to vote. So again, these are just some general factors that influence like voter turnout.